do a terrific newsletter. I say that because I write it. But it actually is a very good newsletter. We have almost 20,000 subscribers to it because 70% of our customers don't live in Arizona. So we reach them that way. And I will put the kitten information into the e-news. So if you haven't signed up for it, you could do that this evening, and then I'll put the link in. So you could donate if you want to. We have given dogs an unfair edge because David Rosenfeld, who is here often, has a link with the Golden Retriever Rescue Society here in Phoenix, and we've raised several $1,000s for that society. David auctions off, and you may do this too, character names, and so you can actually bid, to have your name in a book. Now, this has hit Karin blindsided, so I'm not suggesting that she offered that to you tonight, but perhaps I'm not doing that to you. But maybe the next time she comes, we could set that up in advance. And it's really very nice to be reading along in a book and suddenly find yourself. Of course, you're at the mercy of the author. You could be the serial killer. You could be the coroner.
You could get raped.
That's not a selling point there.
Because a lot of guys will come up to me and say, "Hey, you should put me in one of your books as a character," and I say, "Well, great. You could be raped," and suddenly they don't want to be a character.
Well, okay. So going back to start all over again. How many of you are new to the store this evening? Quite a few of you. Okay. Well, I'm Barbara Peters. I'm the owner of the Poison Pen and Chief Interrogator. We're actually turning 30 in October, and we do about 250 events a year. Almost all of them like this one, in one form or another. It's really very interactive. You will get to ask questions. We talk. And generally, although the Facebook person has gone off with the kittens, so who knows when he'll come back. We do video most of our events so that you can spread the word to your friends. They can watch it on our Facebook, or we have our own YouTube channel if you don't do Facebook. So at some point we'll start that. Anyway, Karin and I have done this together for, this is book 19, so maybe like 16 of your 19 books you have actually been here. And we've been talking, right? So we're delighted to see you back. This is the last night of Karin's tour. So she's sort of behaving like a kid the day before school. Well, actually, the very day the school's out, because she gets to fly home tomorrow.
Yes.
Yay!
Yay!
Yay! So, microphone.
Yes. Oh, so I did it before with the kittens, but I put this on my website, on my Facebook page, the crowd shot. So if you guys could act really energetic and happy to be here, starting now.
Hold your foot up. That's always a good thing.
There you go. Come on, put some out outside. There you go.
Wonderful.
I'm going to speed that up on when I put it on.
I'm afraid that you're going to be aced out by the cute kitten pictures.
I am. I still smell like kittens.
I had to give my dog a haircut. The groomer did not do. She came home. She's a little rescue dog. She's part Shiba Inu and part pinscher and all, and she looks like a fox. But she came home looking like a poodle with this huge top knot from the groomer, who apparently missed it. So I had to wrestle her down this morning and scissor her off. So I know I'm covered with dog hair and general dog smell, but the kittens didn't mind.
No, and I'm covered in kitten fur, but that was before the kittens.
It was. All right. So here we are, book 19, but book 9 for Will Trent. Now, you've had an awful lot of interviews, media coverage, all kinds of interesting things about this book. And one of the reviews that I read, you were talking about why Jeffrey exited your life and also Sarah's. And I thought that was an interesting thing maybe to talk about for a minute from a writer's perspective. And I'm assuming that one of the reasons is that you really wanted to move the series or move your characters to Atlanta. You'd kind of done what you wanted to do with the county. Sarah could relocate because she's a doctor, but Jeffrey was the police guy in the county, so he had to go.
So
Sad,
if
right?
you've never read the Grant County books, you don't have to because Barbara just told you.
It's perfectly apparent when you read this book since he is referenced, so it's not like it's a big surprise.
Yeah, well, so part of the reason was just a lot of really horrible stuff was happening in this small town. And, you know, it was just overrun with pedophiles and rapists and murderers and serial killers, and it was worse than Congress. And I thought, but not by much, yeah. And I thought, you know, it just doesn't seem likely that anyone would want to live there. And maybe they're not moving because they can't sell their house. But and also I was writing about, and still write about, some very heavy topics. And the reason I love writing about crime is not the details of the crime so much as what happens afterward, right? How does it affect people? How do they recover from it? What does it do to the community? And the things that were happening in Grant County had to, at some point, touch these people personally. And they did. And Sarah had this great loss. And I knew about the fourth book that I was going to end Grant County. I knew how I was going to end it. So I had the luxury of being able to write toward that goal. There's foreshadowing in it, so I didn't do it completely out of the blue. But between the fourth and fifth Grant County, I wrote the first Will Trent. And then after the sixth Grant County, between the fifth and sixth, I wrote Will Trent. Then after the sixth, where that ended, I wrote about Will again. And then in the third Will book, Sarah comes to Atlanta. And that was all planned out. It was very deliberate on my part. And I just wanted to write about grief and loss and love and all these big things. And the best way to do that is to kill somebody.
Well, that's very true. But you also gained a bigger stage by writing about Atlanta, which is, after all, where you live. And where all those kinds of things are not so improbable in their frequency as they were in Grant County, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, you know, I mean, it's weird because Atlanta is not that violent.
No.
America, I mean, despite all these horrible mass shootings and everything, we're far less violent now as a society than we've ever been in our history. So violence has dropped considerably in Atlanta, and what I'm writing about is not the kind of violence big cities see, which is one drug dealer killing another drug dealer, or, you know, occasionally prostitutes are murdered, or, you know, people who would be considered on the margins are more likely to be victims of these sorts of crimes. And occasionally there are very what we call interesting crimes that we can read about or put in a book, and those are the ones that I seek out.
Well, that always reminds me, I used to live in the South, and I spent a lot of time playing tournament bridge in Atlanta, which is sort of my big view of Atlanta, but nonetheless, it's always struck me as kind of like a free city in Georgia, almost like Hong Kong. I mean, it has an international airport, it's an enormous business capital, tons of banking. If you are an African American, making in Atlanta is as significant or more so than making it in New York. So Atlanta is a fascinating city to write about, and in some respects fascinating because it's in a place that otherwise is not like Atlanta.
Well, it's true. I mean, it's a very integrated city. I was just in New York, and it always strikes me how segregated New York is, especially publishing. You don't see a lot of different types of faces in publishing. It's predominantly white. But I'm a minority in Atlanta. And we do have the largest African American middle class of any major American city. We have, since the early 1970s, had an African American government, and, you know, business gets along very well with government. And our police force, this is the most important thing, our police force looks like the people they're policing. And that's why we don't have a lot of the other problems that big cities do. I mean, we're a pretty calm city as far as these big upheavals we've been seeing around racial violence and that kind of thing. Not that we don't have it, but it helps when the police look like everybody else.
Well, I think it's a really interesting city to write about, and one of the great things about Atlanta is something you write about in this book, which is the CDC. And you've spent a fair amount of time preparing for this book. You actually, if I remember right, put this book off for a couple while you were working on the plot and the research and so forth that has gone into, well, you tell us about why the CDC is important. Why am I telling you? It's her book.
It is, but you know, so I live less than a mile from the CDC, and it's on the campus of Emory University. And I've always been fascinated by it, just because it's so terrifying to think about Ebola and hemorrhagic fever and all the things that they store there. And it's a very secure facility. It was not as secure before the anthrax attacks, which happened around 9/11, so that they tend to get a little overshadowed. But the best thing that ever happened during that attack was the person who sent the anthrax through the mail sent it to politicians, so suddenly it was a national nightmare. And they went to the CDC and they saw that it was in disrepair, it didn't have a lot of funding, and they said, well, we need to fund this. This is something all of them agreed on, because you know, it was, I think a Republican and a Democrat were sent anthrax, so they finally came together on that. That's what it takes, basically. And they came together and they really funded it. The history of the CDC is fascinating to me because in Atlanta, Coca-Cola historically has been a big driver of a lot of things that modernize the city. The chairman of Coca-Cola, for instance, was the man who said when Martin Luther King Jr. won the Pulitzer Prize, we are going to have a party to celebrate this. And if you want to come to my house ever again, you will be at this party, right? And he gave $100 million in Coke stock to Emory University, which is why when you drive through the campus, a lot of the windows have a green tint like the Coca-Cola bottle. And the CDC, well, that was a guy who was running Coca-Cola, and he said, I'm sick of my golf caddies getting malaria. Malaria was a really big problem in the South, and I'm going to donate this land and this facility on the Emory campus so we can wipe out this malaria problem and I can get my caddy back. And that's what they did, and that's the CDC, and that's how they started, and eventually they grew. They're attached to the Navy. They're part of the uniformed services, so in the headquarters you see people walking around in uniforms. And that comes from when the Navy was in charge of ports and they needed to quarantine ships, so they got medical professionals there. And it was just fascinating being there. And you can't just walk onto the campus, you have to get an invitation. And I was at a party, which is weird because I don't really go to parties. And there was a guy there who was in a corner. And I thought, okay, well that corner's taken, I'll be in this corner. And the dog was there, so I, was petting the dog. And this is usually like the best thing that happens to me at a party is to find an animal of a pet. And then I saw the guy coming toward the dog, and I'm like, what the hell, man? You had your corner. And he started talking to the dog, and he mentioned to the dog that he worked for the CDC, and I was like, wait a minute. You are suddenly very interesting to me. And he was an investigator. They dropped these disease investigators into hot zones, like after Katrina, to test the water, to figure out what's going to make people sick and how to stop that from happening. And I got onto the campus, and I got to walk around and talk to people. And primarily I wanted to make sure what I was writing about my book could not be duplicated. I wanted to know, I kind of knew how to do it, but I didn't want to do it in a way that people could read it and go, hey, this is great, let me go get a pot and pan, right? So I talked to them about ways to not teach people how to do bad things. But when I told them my initial idea, it looked like this guy had shit in his pants. And it reminded me after 9/11, a lot of crime writers were asked by the Pentagon to come in and brainstorm what horrible thing would you do? Because Clancy wrote a novel about an airplane hitting the White House, right?
I think it was the White House. I remember Vince Flynn, when he was still alive, had been invited to go to the...
Yeah, they only invited the boys. They should have invited us because we came up with the girls came up with a lot of nastier things. But that was one thing I had to do for this book. And, one of the things I do when I talk to law enforcement is I say, what scares you right now? Because I think if it scares them, it's going to terrify people who read my books, and I always want to make sure I'm terrifying people. And I was hearing from a lot of people saying, You know, it's not the opioid crisis, it's not sex trafficking, it's not the things you would think, it's us. I'm really afraid of us. Because the militias, the white supremacist extremists, the Klan, were all on the upswing during the Obama years. And the budget for monitoring these people was cut in half. You know, the focus was on terrorists from outside coming in. And under Trump, it was completely cut off. And they don't have the resources to investigate people and to follow these groups. And they're very highly coordinated. They're international groups. The guy in Christchurch had connections to an American white supremacist group who has connections to the Norwegian white supremacist group. These are internationally connected terrorists, and they're trying to kill us. They want to start a race war. And it's not a political thing, you know. There's no political party in the United States of America today that has in its mission statement, start a race war, we only want white people. I mean, there are certainly politicians who say stupid things, but that's politicians. It's not politics, it's right and wrong. My great-grandfather and my grandfather fought in a war to stop this ideology. I'm sure you have family members too. And it just boils down to they are wrong and we are right. And we have to remember that. And so when I was doing the research for this book, I was talking to a lot of people about, you know, taking the politics out of it and how to frame it in a way where it was really clear that this is an aberration and we need to stop it. And hopefully that's what I accomplished in the book.
So what actually happens, or one of the things that triggers off the plot, is that somebody who works for the CDC is kidnapped, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a pretty terrifying thought.
Yes. And that's in the first chapter. That's actually
no more spoilers.
No more spoilers. If you read the jacket, it says that. You know, it happened. Someone from the CDC just disappeared, and there were all these rumors about what had happened to him. They think that he may have been suicidal, and his family's not good. And this happened a while ago, and then we didn't hear about it. And it kind of reminded me, because Emory has the Yerkes Primate Center. And a friend of mine who used to work at Emory University signed me up to the email list. And sometimes there's an alert that a monkey is missing. And then you never hear anything, right? And you think, this is in a residential neighborhood. Where is that monkey? You know, and it's like, what other secrets are they keeping? I mean, I could do a Michael Crichton kind of book on it, I guess.
You could. Right, well, we know that there are chimpanzees who've done some serious damage to people, but are these smaller primates?
Well, they have all kinds of them, but you're not allowed to use chimpanzees for the invasive research anymore. Basically, you can do behavioral stuff, and if they don't feel like doing it, you can't make them do it.
These were people who unwisely kept chimpanzees.
Oh yeah, Travis the chimpanzee.
Yes,
yeah.
As companions or whatever. There was a really weird thing I read. I almost never get lost in some rabbit hole like from the New York Post or something, but for whatever reason, I happened to click on a story about this girl from China who adopted a puppy, and the puppy is adorable, and it's black, and it's cute, and it's got 4 legs and all. And then she didn't know anything about puppies, so she fed it noodles, and it was hungry, and it kept eating, and she fed it more food. After a while, it began to stand up on its hind legs, and that didn't seem very dog-like. And it got bigger, and it got bigger. Anyway, it all turns out that it was a bear. And so they had to send somebody but if you look, they actually have photos of it. As a baby, it really did look like a big fluffy black puppy on its 4 legs and all. But anyway, they eventually had to come and move it away to, I think it was an Asiatic black bear or something, and take it to a habitat where it would be happy and so forth. But my point is that it's amazing how clueless people can be. We were in South Africa, and I still remember the guards saying to us, because it had just happened, there was a Chinese couple there on their honeymoon, and they were driving along, and this great elephant was standing over there, and so they stopped and got out of their car and started photographing the elephant, who came over and stomped them to death. Elephants are not pets. It's not a zoo, and it's interesting to me that people don't seem to be as cognizant now of that as maybe they once were.
Yeah, it's funny because I got a generator after the first time our power went out, and when it was out for 8 hours. We were ready to eat the animals. I mean, it was just like, what are we gonna do? Yeah. And I think people do forget animals can be as crazy as we are.
Or that they're actually dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, just to finish up that little discussion, in South Africa, the ranger's job is not to keep people safe from the animals, is to keep the animals safe from the people. Because they did have another elephant escape from a reserve, and by the time they got there an hour later, there was nothing left of the elephant at all. The villagers had completely deconstructed the elephant. So, the interface between people and animals, we live that here, if you live up north, you may have like rattlesnakes in your backyard, or the odd coyote that strolls through, or down in Tucson, haven't they had like mountain lions, or whatever it is? So, what do you have in Atlanta? Do you have burrows?
We have, we have brown recluse spiders and rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmouths. But I don't really watch crazy TV because I love it too much, but I watch it in a hotel room, so I've seen a lot of Locked Up. And there's this show called I Was Prey. Have you guys seen that? This guy, he found a rattlesnake. It's either in Texas or Florida. And this guy found a rattlesnake, and he used a hoe to chop its head off. And then he went to pick it up, and the rattlesnake head bit him, which I did not know was a thing. Yeah. So that was interesting.
Well, we've digressed, but as we often say, the animal portion of this program is over. Tell me what the difference is between the CDC and the NIH, if in fact that's something you know.
Well, the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes for Health. I think the NIH is more research into medical application of pharmaceuticals and treatments, and the Center for Disease Control is anything that can kill you. So if they have this NASA-like control room where they have maps of the entire world on screen. It's called, I want to say Skynet, that's not it. Could be, Red Sky. And so they have like yellow dots, green dots, red dots all over the place. And some of it you think, okay, well that's obviously Ebola, because I know about that. But other places are lead poisoning in water, right? Or contaminated water, or we had a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, or the hurricane. They're tracking that hurricane because they want to be able to respond when it hits. But they're not just for the United States. They're internationally recognized for being able to not just find a way to treat disease, but to actually say, okay, well, we'll take this strain of Ebola back to our lab in Atlanta because we can compare it with the 7 known strains, and we can tell you where this is from, what type it is, and that's how they figured out how to create a vaccine for the particular type that's affecting Nigeria right now, right? So they have all kinds of resources that are used worldwide. They ship anthrax, actually, if people want to study it, and they ship all kinds of diseases around the world, and they control outbreaks here in the United States.
Right, well, with so much travel, it's becoming a bigger problem. I read today in the Wall Street Journal that Europe has had 90,000 cases of measles this year, which is a disease that was more or less about to go. And so, without making a political statement, vaccination is pretty good idea, especially if you might, be pregnant or other things. And they have certain powers. They can actually, wasn't there some guy with tuberculosis on a plane, and they can force you into quarantine? And if you travel a lot, you should really check to see what the CDC has to say about a destination that you're going with, because people can't. I think the measles outbreak in California was a New Zealand teenager who went to Disneyland, or maybe it was in Florida, I can't remember which, but airplanes are like a giant machine for spreading all these things. So I bet the CDC is busier now than ever.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, I mean, good for them though.
Yeah.
Keeps them in business.
So tell us about Will. Will has had an interesting life. How much do we know about Will by the time we get to this book?
Well, you don't know everything. I will say that one of the reasons why Sarah and Jeffrey are no longer together is they were very, very happy in that last book. And that's boring, and it's hard to write about. Will never be 100% happy, so that's by design. I think he's in a good place in the beginning of this book, but he doesn't really know what Sarah is thinking. And he's realized that, a lot of people say, oh, I love Will, especially a lot of women say, oh, I love Will. And I remind him he's fictional because he takes out the trash without being asked, and he cleans up after himself, and all these wonderful things. But he's a man who has a lot of bad things have happened to him, and a lot of times he doesn't talk about those bad things. And what he does is he lies by omission. And Sarah does not want to have that happen, right? So he's lying to her all the time. She's getting angry about it. And it's a real challenge to write that dynamic because everybody rooted for Tony Soprano. No one rooted for Carmela. Everybody thought, she just needs to stop nagging at him for having sex with prostitutes and doing drugs up. What is her problem? Or Skylar going after Walter White. People hated her for nagging him for selling or creating the best methamphetamine anyone ever had and killing people. They were like, Skylar just needs to leave him alone, So I have to be a little careful with Sarah getting mad at Will for lying to her. And that's kind of a challenge in the writing, but I think they're in a good place at the beginning of this book. Well, and one thing I did was the first 3 chapters and subsequent chapters, but specifically the first 3, take place in the same time period. So it's sort of like, the 1970s 3-panel screen. So it opens with Sarah, and she's in the kitchen with her mother at her aunt's house, and her mother is saying what every woman in this room has probably heard from her mother, which is everything she's done wrong with her life so far, and what she needs to change. And then we go to Will, and Will is cutting the grass, and his part with Sarah, we meet Will through Sarah, and then we meet Sarah through Will. And Sarah is thinking, oh, he's so sweet, he totally gets me, he understands what I'm saying. And Will is thinking, oh, we're going to have sex. So that was a little fun to write with. And just figuring out how to build the tension, because of course during the middle of all this, something really bad happens. An explosion shakes the ground. And then we cut to Faith, and the timeline shifts back a little bit. So we're waiting for the bad thing to happen and for her to find out what that is. And for us to find out what there's this explosion, what happened next, who did this. And that was really fun doing in the book, just introducing these characters kind of in a different way. One of the great thrills of writing a series is I don't feel like I have to tell you everything about Will and Sarah when you meet them. I tell you enough so you know who they are. And if you want to know even more, you can go back and read the other books, or if that's the only book you read, then you still get a good story. And that's a nice, I think, tightrope to walk as a writer, to figure out how to do all that.
Sarah, do you feel more comfortable writing these multiple points of view than you might have at the beginning?
Well, at the beginning, I didn't even think about any of the structure. It just kind of happened by accident.
Yeah.
In my first novel, Blindsided, which I really loved, but I wrote it very quickly, and I was very excited about it, and I was taking on these big themes, and I thought I was getting older. I thought 30 was going to be like this, oh my God, I'm an old woman now. But, there are things that I would do differently if I wrote that book for the first time now. But with this, I felt there's just a confidence that comes from writing so many books and from growing older, that that's the unfortunate price you pay, or that your knees pay, is that you have to get older. And I really just enjoyed writing this story, figuring out how to build the suspense, how to lay down the plot, how to tell these different things about Will and Sarah. One of the things that I've done with Sarah from the beginning is she's a healer, she helps people, she's this nice person. And in this book, she's using all her medical knowledge to hurt people and hopefully kill them. So that was a nice kind of new thing for me to do. And it's funny because whenever I talk to cops, every single cop has the perfect murder. They just know it. The first thing they do when they get to a crime scene is say, well, you should have done it this way, because then we wouldn't know, And I didn't realize that doctors have all kinds of ways to kill people that they keep in their heads too. So I was talking to my friend David, who's helped me from the second book with medical stuff. So Sarah sounds like she knows what she's doing. And I said, hey, I'm thinking Sarah's going to be hurting people. He's like, let me get my list. So that was nice. He's retired now, so that's awesome.
So he's keeping up his professional insurance, no copywriting. Yeah, I asked that question in part because Karin and I actually met. We had lunch together in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. It was it a year before your first book published? So, I said to her, so what's your book about? And there was no knowledge at all on my part because the book had not appeared. It's really interesting to meet an author, before you get to read their books, and I've always remembered that. I can't even remember what we talked about at lunch. It was you and Rob and Val McDermott, if I remember right. Do you remember what you said about the book?
Probably something really stupid because I'm really bad at describing my books. And that's the one thing you should know the answer to. But the way I write, I think it's very hard to describe the book without giving away a lot of spoilers, right?
So, but that wasn't really an issue because
no,
after all, I was going to be selling it, so it didn't matter if I knew how it all came out. But,
no, I don't like people to know though.
Yeah.
I'm the youngest of 3 girls, and I always kept secrets. And usually it wasn't because I was being nice to my sisters. It was because a lot of times when I would get in trouble, it'd go like my dad would say, what's this bad grade you got on your math exam? And I would say, well, I've just been up all night because I'm so worried about this boy my sister is seeing. So I like to reveal the secrets in my own way. And when people say, what's your book about? I say it's about 500 pages.
She was a crime writer way back when she was a kid, right? Her sisters were the victims. I love it. There's an explosion, and there's the kidnapping, and all of that takes place early on. Is there anything else that you want to mention?
No, I think that's it.
Get any spoilers going, right? So let's go back and talk about your last book for a minute, because you were actually here for that one. What feedback did you have? What do you feel now that you're a year or two out from that book? What would you say about it?
Well, I feel really good, and actually, once I write a book, normally I don't have to talk about it much again. I talk about the books I've been touring for 6 months basically, so I've talked about this book in many different languages. But with Pieces of Her, my last novel, I've been talking about it more because it was optioned by Netflix. And they're in the process of writing the scripts now. They're hopefully going to have casting news soon and it's really exciting. And I was in the writer's room in California in March. This is not the important part of the story. And just sitting there thinking, wow, here are these 6 writers and the producers and all these people have jobs now because I sat down in my pajamas 2 years ago with my laptop and wrote this story. I mean, it's just really surreal. And I really love the vision they have for it. And Netflix is amazing. There are all kinds of horror stories about network people coming in and changing everything. And they don't want to change things. They want it to be as close to the book as possible. They've given really good notes about it. So, I mean, that's a relief. Because I remember David Houston told me a long time ago that having something adapted was like going to the dentist and having them pull all your teeth while they put money in your pocket. And that hasn't been my experience at all. It's just been really great, and I'm excited. I hope that if it stays on schedule, they'll have it streaming by the end of next year.
So this is going to be serial television, not just one episode?
Yeah, it's eight episodes, a limited edition.
Why did they, do you think, pick on Pieces of Her instead of one of your Will Trent books? Is it easier to develop just a standalone book?
Well, I think yes and no. It just depends on who has the vision. But the thing is, I mean, yes, it's nice to have someone want to do one of your books, but I've said no to a lot of people for the Will Trent and the Grant County series. I've said no more times over the years than I can count because the books mean a lot to me. I mean, I think of them as my legacy, hopefully a long, long legacy. And I really am proud of what I talked about in these books, about violence against women, about rape, about sexual harassment, about all the issues that I've tackled. And I don't want someone to do what Hollywood did for a long time, which is take the titles of the books or the characters' names and then make it something very sort of anathema to what I was trying to do. And Netflix, those kinds of places, they don't shy away from the violence. And that's an important part of my book. So a lot of times I've said no, and we're actually talking to someone right now, and the woman who would write the series, I had dinner with her in Atlanta, and she had the best question. She said, why did Jeffrey cheat on Sarah? And I thought, that's a real fan question. She really gets, if she's still wondering about that, that's a really good sign. So we'll see, but I'm not gonna just jump at something because someone wants to do it.
No, the thing is too, if you sell one of your series, then they own it, and so it becomes very difficult for you to do other things with it. You can't write that character out of. I mean, the standalone is a safer bet. If it's a whole book and they take it away, then you're not barred from doing things with your. I think selling your bread and butter series would be a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, it would have to be to the right person.
Yeah.
And very early on, when I would get calls, they would say things like, "Well, why could we set it in South London instead of the Southern United States?" Or how about we film it in Poland because that looks like a lot like Atlanta. I mean, it was just really crazy stuff like that. And I always said no because I'm not going to do it. And frankly, I mean, the option money is nice, but it's not enough money to sell my soul.
So tell us about, for those of us who don't know, tell us about what a writer's room is. How does that work? Because it's so different than being a novelist.
It's something that I would never do. I would hate it. It's very collaborative. And I'm not that kind of writer. I mean, I tried to be. Gillian Flynn loves it. I mean, there are writers who really love that, and I don't. I'm getting a cough drop. I've been talking a long time.
Well, while you're taking your cough drop, Lisa Lutz was here 2 Fridays ago, or last Friday, I can't remember which. Anyway, and Lisa, who is a very idiosyncratic novelist, she wrote the Spellman Files and those books, and I really think she's a wonderful writer. She loves the writer's room. She really likes writing scripts and working with people. And I find that interesting because books are created by people sitting alone, and in rooms just with their laptops and so forth. And it seems to me a whole different skill set, and it requires negotiation, it requires cooperation, all kinds of things. I always remember Sue Grafton sitting here and saying, I don't play well with others, so I can only write books. Yeah. She hated Hollywood. She never wanted to sell her books to Hollywood.
Well, I mean, I don't mind selling it, but I think when you do, you turn it over completely. Yeah. And I actually did try to write a script with this guy. I did, and he was really wonderful, and he's got amazing credits, and he totally got, it was for Grant County, he totally got all of the series, and he loved crime fiction. And I remember we were in his car going to a studio or something, and he said, we got this note from Kevin about this particular passage, and I think we need to look at it. And I said, who's Kevin? And he said, oh, he's an old soul, he's an intern, he's in high school, but he's really smart. And I thought, and that's the sort of thing that happens, everybody gets an opinion, and you don't get to say, fuck Kevin. I mean, get out of high school and then we'll talk.
Probably doesn't have a driver's license. He's driving my car.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, he's probably running a studio now. But I don't like that kind of thing because I think you can get too much input. And when I write my books, it's me and my editor. We're the only ones who know the plot. We're the only ones who know the story. We're the only ones who read the pages. If you want me to do something in a book, the worst thing you can do is tell me to do it, because it will not happen. I will find a way not to do that, because I just want it to be my story and what I'm doing.
Well, do you have Why don't we ask for questions from the audience, because we probably said all we want to say, or all Karin at least wants to say about The Last Widow, or that you want to hear. So who has a
Questions about
question?
books, monkeys, snakes. Yes.
I love your books, and I love how it gets like really, really creepy and gross, and then you just, I think this can't get any worse, and then you just take that next step.
Yeah.
How do you get there? Where do you get those details from? Like,
Why do you read it?
It's like,
I get it from a lot of, so in Georgia, I think you have sunshine laws here, don't you? Where if a case has been adjudicated, I can get any part of the
Oh,
case.
okay.
Yeah, I can get interviews with suspects, witnesses, all that, the autopsy reports. I'm very, very mindful when I'm writing a story that this is a real crime. This has happened to someone. I want to respect that. I never take one file and put all the details in a book. I pick different pieces to make sure it's not one identifiable criminal or victim. And that's really the work that goes into to finding those details, is I pick them out from actual crime scene stuff. And, you know, I think when you write crime fiction, you have to decide what kind of crime fiction writer are you going to be. Are you going to be the kind that fades to black? Are you going to show everything? I wanted to write the details because I think it's important. I think if this is not the kind of book you like to read, don't read it. I'm fine with that. There are a lot of other people you can read, but I'm never going to pull my punches. I'm not going to make rape look sexy. I'm not going to have... One of the things that really pissed me off before I was published, and what made me write Blindsided, was reading so many books in the 1990s where a woman was sexually assaulted. It was either really sexual and kind of kinky and fun, or the woman was sexually assaulted and then she became an alcoholic, or she was really sad. And those were the only two things. And the way she was healed was that she had beautiful sex with the hero of the book. And that is not how it happens. I mean, a rape is akin to murder. The person that you were going to be is no longer going to happen in your life, right? And I want to write about that as realistically as I can. And I want to write about other crimes as realistically as I can. Because not talking about it is not stopping it. And I want to be an honest writer about these topics.
Ira, let me just say that you have to be really careful that you can't write about an open case or a case in progress. I won't name a particular writer, but there is a writer who, stumped for a plot, actually took an open case and wrote a book about it, and a huge lawsuit ensued. The parents of the kids who were involved in that particular crime sued the author and the publisher and so forth. It was really awful. So you can't just, like go down to look at the police blotter and say, oh look, here's a crime and case in progress. I know, but it's a really it's a real invasion of privacy. In a way, it's a rape of its own, if you think about it. Sorry, there were questions over there. You're calling, so you pick.
Usually I always get your audiobooks. Did you choose Kathleen early? Like, I love listening to her with audiobooks.
I did, yeah. She's an amazing reader. My first few books, Kathleen's actually gone back and recorded them because I asked for that. Because the readers, even though some of them were Southern, they didn't get the right Southern accent. Because Texas is not the South, Florida is not the South, right? Those accents are very different. Alabama is very different from Georgia. Louisiana, they have sticks in their mouth. It's just like or Arkansas. You're never going to get rid of that. You can be a Rhodes Scholar. I mean, John Grisham still has that Arkansas accent. So Kathleen really gets it. She's from Texas, but her grandmother lived in Savannah. And what bothered me the most was the earlier readers would make Sarah sound very, very country because they read she was from South Georgia. But she's very educated, and she lived in Atlanta, and my accent is an Atlanta accent. And the readers just weren't getting that. They had this sort of Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara kind of thing. Or one of them had it sound like someone had shaken a trailer and she had fallen out. I mean, it was just that kind of thing. So I'm really glad you like Kathleen, because I think she does an amazing job. Yes?
Going back to Jeffrey and Sarah, I was kind of surprised that Sarah totally fell apart for you. Probably because of my age group. I know so many widows, and I'm always astounded at how they cope. Sarah, educated, smart, medical profession, is totally falling apart.
Well, I think part of it was how it happened. The other part is she's much younger. You know, Sarah was in her late 20s when this happened. She hadn't been out of medical school that long, so I think that being a young widow and having this life plan for you that was taken away, and the struggles they went through to get back together, that it was a lot more damaging for her. And you know, I had a friend who had this happen, and she was very similar to Sarah. She was a lawyer. She had her own law firm, and she ended up closing it and just, you know, not being able to function because that loss was too devastating for her. I can understand, having been with someone for 27 years, it's a lot easier. The more years you have. But yeah, I mean, I think everybody's different. Yes. If you like the woman behind you in the glasses,
The one book that you have that had actually affected me the most and I was most interested in was Coptown.
oh, thanks.
And I wondered why you ended up writing that, considering all of your other books are modern. And in the Me Too, situation that we have now, that book was a real throwback to what you're really trying to get away from. And I was really impressed with it. And I was wondering why you got the idea and why you actually wrote that.
Well, let me also say, if you wonder what happened to Kate and Maggie, I talk about them a little bit, and they're from Coptown, and they're also in The Last Widow. I wrote a book called Criminal, and part of it took place in the 1970s, and it was Amanda Wagner, Will's boss, because I wanted to know why she was such a ball breaker. And so I talked to a lot of retired female officers who came up in the 70s. And listening to their stories, I thought, why didn't she kill everybody? I mean, it was just horrible. And it was such a difference talking to men versus talking to women. You know, the male cops were like, oh my God, the 70s, fantastic. You know, we smoked all the time, we drank all the time, our wives took care of our kids, our mistresses took care of everything else. It was fantastic. And the women police officers said, well, I couldn't get a credit card in my name. I couldn't buy a house. I couldn't rent an apartment as a single woman because they assumed I was a prostitute. My mother stopped talking to me for taking this man's job, right? Everybody either thought I was a lesbian or that I was having orgies with police officers. And the women were asked a few questions when they took a lie detector test to join the police force. The men were not asked. One of them was, are you a virgin? And how many sexual partners have you had? And are you only becoming a police officer so that you can have sex with police officers? And that was in the manual to ask these women. And if men were not asked that. So hearing these stories, it really pissed me off, and I wanted to write about that. And it was hard for me because I normally write about really strong women, but I also write about men who respect women. And that's something I grew up with. My dad was very respectful toward my stepmother until he cheated on her. But he was very respectful toward us, and he made us expect a certain type of behavior from other men in our lives, right? And that was a pattern that I just thought everybody else had. And so it's always shocking to me to hear these horrible stories and the sexual harassment they put up with.
Well, the funniest thing about there were some funny things in the book, and the funniest thing that I will always remember is when you wrote that one of the people would actually call the police department and report stolen police cars because a woman was driving.
Yeah, that's true. That happened several times. They would report the car as stolen if they saw a woman cop, even if she was in uniform. And a woman cop would pull up to take a report, and they would laugh and think it was a joke. It never occurred to them that women would be police officers. Of course, fast forward, now we have an African-American female police chief. We had the first African-American female sheriff in Fulton County. So all of those changes we made in the 70s that were incentivized by the federal government actually have come to fruition. You, in the back, you had your hand up. No? You changed your mind? Oh, okay. Yes.
So my favorite book of yours is Pretty Girls, and every time I recommend you to somebody, I always say, read this, because if you can't read this, you'll be able to read the rest of them.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like, what inspired that? It's a pretty complex story, and it's very dark. I love it, but I'm just curious what got that going for you.
Well, that was another tip from law enforcement, and there's actually a case in California that was the longest running criminal case in the history of California of a man who was doing similar things. He was using VHS tapes. I don't want to ruin the plot for anything. So it was based on talking to these police officers and who look into the dark net and all that. And the funny thing about that is Lee Child and I wrote about the same topic in the same year. And I forget the name of his book, but he read mine first and he said, "You're going to kill me," because I wrote about basically the same thing. And I killed 3 women in that book.
At least.
Jack Reacher killed 3,000, right? and no one said his book was violent or shocking or anything like that. But I took some hits on it. But
He
you're
doesn't
right.
explain it as well as you do.
Yeah,
Like, it's pretty visual.
yeah. But it's based on actual cases.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's one way or another.
Yes. Yes, you.
You collaborated on a book with Lee Child. How was that?
Well, it's a short story called "Cleaning the Gold," and
It's a matchup, isn't it?
no, it wasn't. I probably collaborated twice. Once was with Michael Carita, and that was for Matchup, and Steve Berry was the editor, and we were given a word count. We went over it by twofold, and so we waited a week to turn it in so Steve couldn't say no, and we called it Short Story. So that's why Michael and I get along. We're both assholes to Steve Berry. But Lee and I, we've known each other for years. We've grown up in the business. He's much older than I am, but we both started around the same time, and we've always wanted to do a short story together. He really likes Will Trent. I think Jack Reacher's fantastic, and we wanted to find the right idea. And I was at the library at Fort Knox a couple of years ago, and I thought this would be a good idea. And I saw Lee, and we talked it through and figured out how to do it, and we finally found time to write it.
Anyone else? I have a question about, and I'm trying to, I hope I have her name right, but there was, in Sarah and Will's life, there was what's her name, Lena?
Mm-hmm. Lena?
Okay, and then didn't she have a book of her own, or at least a great
No,
deal
Lena
of
was
it?
in the Grant County series.
Right, oh,
And
it was
she's
Jeffrey and Sarah, okay.
Yeah.
And then didn't you went out, it was like Columbus, Georgia or somewhere, didn't she have?
Macon, yeah,
Macon.
she was. Well, she didn't get her own book, but she
But
did
she
some
had a
really
big chunk
nasty
of it.
things. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
so what's going on with her? She's
Well,
kind of faded away.
Well, she was in a couple of books since then, but the fun thing about writing Lena is I think it's nice to catch up with her at different stages in her life. The last time we saw her, she was at a really low point. And I'm working on the next book for next year, which will be the 10th Will Trent. And my 20th book, it's also a Will and Sarah. And you'll see Lena in that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, because she was a train wreck here and there.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, for those of you missing Lena, I thought I'd remind you. It was Macon, that's
Mhm.
true. I knew it was out of Atlanta and south, right? My geography in Georgia
Yes.
is somewhat shaky, but it is that way, right?
Mhm.
Terrific. Well, I would like to thank all of you, Sarah, not Sarah, Karin. Karin and I, would like, really into this now, would like to thank all of you very much for coming this evening. You've been a great audience on a hot Friday night. And we would like to give you, I would anyway, like to give you a book, as we often do. For those of you who've purchased Karin's book, you should have a number inside it. So first of all, I'm going to say goodbye to our Facebook audience, and thank you very much for joining us. And if you